Meanwhile, we're going to wrap up this section of the conference with a video from Carissa Chew. It's called Assessing and Addressing Representation in the Archives. Carissa is Equalities, Diversity and Inclusion Intern at the National Library of Scotland. So without further ado, here's her video.
Hi, I'm Carissa Chew. I'm a recent MPhil in World History graduate from the University of Cambridge. In terms of my academic career, I researched the marginalisation of people of mixed Black African and South Asian heritage in 20th century Tanzania, Kenya and Uganda. Thinking about my connections to Scotland, I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Edinburgh, and I author an educational website called Histories of Colour, through which I've produced some resources for the general public about Scotland's relationship with the slave trade. And I'm now working as the Equalities, Diversity and Inclusion Intern at the National Library of Scotland. In this presentation, I'm going to share my personal perspectives about the importance of the language that we use within the heritage sector in relation to issues of race, and speak in a professional capacity about the work I'm currently doing at the National Library of Scotland. So I think the first thing we need to consider here is whether language, as it appears in historic documents, in archival catalogues, in museum displays, in statue plaques, and information boards at heritage sites, is neutral. As Nathan Sentence has highlighted in his blog Archival Decolonist, the idea of neutrality in institutions stems from Enlightenment ideas about Eurocentric Western scholarship as a universal and objective form of knowledge. Within this outdated narrative, non-Western knowledge has been devalued as something that is inherently biased and irrational. We need to think about whether heritage institutions have traditionally presented colonial perspectives of history as undisputed fact. The reality is that some of the language contained within Scottish heritage collections has historically functioned, whether intentionally or not, to marginalise, demonise, scapegoat, exclude or silence certain social groups, especially BAME communities. Although there are many instances of overtly racist language and imagery appearing within these collections, practices of exclusion are not always explicit or conscious. Racism also manifests itself in quite subtle ways, and is in many ways embedded in the structures of our everyday language. The meaning of certain words has changed over time, moreover, as terms that were once deemed acceptable by society at large are understood as offensive today. What we need to ask ourselves is, how does the cultural heritage sector make choices about what language it uses when telling historical narratives and describing historical materials and the people and organisations who created or are represented in them? Do these choices impact whether certain groups of people feel included or excluded in heritage spaces? Working within the Archives and Manuscripts Division, the aim of my 6-month internship at the National Library of Scotland is to help draft a descriptive practices policy that our institution can use to ensure that our catalogue records and interpretive work meet modern descriptive standards relating to protected characteristics such as race, gender, religion or belief, sexual orientation and disability, and other cultural sensitivities such as class. My work expands into various collections beyond archives and manuscripts, and will also help to inform initiatives to address wider issues of biases and silences in the collections of the library. My role looks at descriptive practices within 3 specific contexts. Firstly, descriptions created by the library as finding aids. Secondly, contextual information created by the library to support the collections. And thirdly, original descriptions in the context of being made available through digitisation. This final context depends on issues of access, however, given that my internship is being carried out from home. To give some background, the purpose of the National Library of Scotland is twofold. It is a library of deposit and a memory institution collecting and preserving the recorded history and culture of Scotland in all formats, according to a declared policy. The library's online catalogue, in reality various catalogues, has evolved over many years and through many versions, manuscript, printed and published, on card and now online. Retroconversion programs are still adding to the online record, and descriptions of resources which date back many years are now being made accessible to a wide audience online, meaning that now more than ever there's a pressing need to review our descriptions and titles which are controversial, offensive or carry slurs. While my focus today is mostly on the archives, in my slides I will also reference examples from the printed collections. However, in terms of addressing change, specific approaches may differ between the printed and archival record. It is necessary to understand that traditional archival descriptive practice was that of concise statements, affected historically by factors such as the cost of publishing catalogues and availability of cataloguing time. Descriptions often remain limited, particularly at the level of inventories, but they need to be expanded in order to address the fundamental questions asked by the source. By whom, when, what, as in document type, and less fully, why and where. Archival inventories are very brief statements serving as limited finding aids, whereas full cataloguing practices treat the above questions in greater detail and include all authority headings. The National Library of Scotland has expanded from a traditional user base of academics with a research focus to a wider public, and with that comes a need for fuller information. So to give an overview of some of the key elements of my work, firstly, there's the question of how do we identify offensive material? I've been using the published glossaries of other institutions and organisations as my starting point, and using these I've been conducting a keyword search across our library catalogues and websites to find examples of offensive materials and description, some of which are shown on the screen for the sake of sharing the nature of the issue we are dealing with. In addition to identifying descriptions for closer scrutiny, the search results will help me to evolve glossaries of offensive terminology identified in the catalogue and to consider preferred terminology. These glossaries will be maintained as a point of reference by and for our staff after my internship ends, but of course language is not set in stone, and there are a lot of caveats and context to consider. My aim is to establish exemplars that will be the foundation for developing practice. Working from home and unable to access the archival collections particularly, it is difficult to judge the appropriateness of certain terms without additional context and some subject-specific expertise. For example, is the subject in question an Eskimo, or are they an Inuit who has been incorrectly labelled as an Eskimo? I've also been identifying sensitive content through speaking to our curators about their collecting areas and flagging up areas of concern, such as plantation records, missionary papers and photographs, and the Boer War. Another question is, should we be encouraging those who use our catalogue to report concerns over representation? How would we manage these reports? And how can we involve external communities, including scholars, in our decision process, and who do we involve? The next element to consider is, what do modern standards of descriptive practice look like in this context? As part of my role, I have been researching the descriptive practices policies of a range of heritage institutions across the world, in particular countries addressing the colonial past. Consensus is currently lacking, but ideas are definitely developing. The USA has been very much leading the way in terms of reviewing language that is offensive to Black and Native American communities and redressing biased narratives about slavery. And there's a lot of resources already out there to help other institutions address these specific issues. Likewise, the Australian heritage sector has developed an inclusive approach for dealing with Aboriginal histories. In UK archives and libraries, where many are still at an early stage in the process of developing strategies for dealing with culturally and racially sensitive or harmful language, it is clear that different institutions are addressing the issue of language in slightly different ways and have adapted their methodologies to suit their specific needs. For example, the RACE Archives in Manchester celebrates linguistic inconsistency in its descriptive work as a natural consequence of the fact that it is a community-based archive, and local communities are actively involved in the archival process and can influence their own representation. The next issue to consider is accuracy and integrity. There is a responsibility to describe people, groups, and cultures accurately and respectfully in a way that will not be harmful or offensive, but also maintain the context of the original. It would be inappropriate to censor or alter sensitive language that appears within original documents or published titles, as this would falsify the historical record, and it's important to preserve the integrity of historical collections. We also need to think about how we might monitor our practice to keep our work current and up to date. A further way to ensure accuracy is to add in additional historical context about the source, its language, and its author, either at the record level or at a higher level, including on web features. But it is important to think about what information should be provided and in what instances this is practically possible. And finally, alongside reviewing derogatory language, it is equally important to review aggrandizing language that has traditionally been used to describe white authors whose legacies are now viewed as controversial. In terms of qualifiers and authority headings, where original language cannot be avoided, it should be qualified. So for example, the use of quotation marks shows the original language of the author, creator, or former owner. The inclusion of text in square brackets can be used to qualify outdated terms in original description. We can also develop a fuller use of authority headings, including subject topical headings, so that there is not a reliance on having to search using derogatory terms. For example, using headings such as colonialism, slavery, racism quite generally, and then anti-blackness more specifically. African history is again another very generalized one, but that could be narrowed down with more specific headings like Kenya and then Maasai even more specifically, just as an example. It is also possible to have effective cross-referencing of authority headings with appropriate scope notes. So, for example, these could explain the significance of Eskimo in contrast to Inuit for the user. It's also important to ensure the inclusion of appropriate headings to avoid issues of underrepresentation. And one further question that all of these possible actions raise is the issue of how do we manage changes in our catalogues over time? Do we preserve former descriptions? Should they be made visible to our users, or do we simply write over them for practicality? Another element that my work considers is how do we surface the diversity that exists in our collections? The role of descriptive notes within archival catalogues is to indicate to users the key information about a historical record. Whilst archivists strive for neutrality, the task of deciding what is and is not important is an inherently subjective one. Description in many cases requires individual interpretation. In many instances, historic descriptive practices have made BAME histories within our catalogues invisible. For example, finding aids relating to plantation records may not mention that these documents contain snippets of information detailing the lived experiences of enslaved African people. Finally, how do we deal with offensive language and culturally sensitive material that appears in original documents? To prevent users unwittingly encountering sensitive or harmful material that may cause offence, it is important to add advisory warnings to our catalogues. There's a question of where and when we should add this advisory content, whether it should appear on a catalogue homepage in subject-specific research guides, when users search particular terms in the catalogue, on individual catalogue records, or at the front of digitised material. For example, if a physical note appears within a record, it can also be photocopied when the item is digitised. Alternatively, a warning screen can be added to the beginning of digital moving images content. To communicate to our users the work we're doing, it's also vital to be as transparent as possible. It's recommended that institutions publish statements acknowledging these issues relating to offensive language and culturally sensitive content in their archives, and explain to users how they might use the updated catalogue to discover BAME histories. To sum up, the use of outdated, inaccurate, or derogatory language impedes access to archives for BAME communities. It's important to reduce reliance on problematic and outdated terminology for descriptive practices and be transparent when dealing with the issue. We need to address the uncomfortable language legacy in our collections to make the Scottish heritage sector more inclusive. I hope that my work as an intern at the National Library of Scotland will help to encourage a culture of self-reflexive critique when it comes to the language we choose to describe historic materials. Ultimately, I hope that my work will help to make marginalised groups in Scotland feel more included and represented within our archives.
Thank you very much for that, Carissa. I think that was really interesting. And I know that an awful lot of our local groups that we represent in particular are also involved in archive resources. So having a gold standard presentation from the National Library of Scotland is incredibly useful to us and very instructive for us in our own SCT group chat. Goswell has just been saying that we really need to get a glossary set up for our website, and she's absolutely right. So you're already inspiring change within our own organisation. So thank you very much for that.